Hi there, me again. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about VJ Day. We're coming up to that time of year. Many people think that World War II ended on the 8th of May 1945. Well, the war in Europe ended then, but the war against Japan continued. For the British, VJ Day is commemorated on August the 15th, the day Japan surrendered. It was still August the 14th in Japan and the USA, for you perfectionists, because of the time difference. In the USA, it's commemorated on the day the surrender was signed, which was 2nd of September 1945. Most people will know the names of aircraft such as the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Lancaster, and the opposing Messerschmitts and Fokkers and Junkers and Dorniers. But who amongst you has heard of the Vultee Vengeance and the Zero? Some, but not many amongst the under 60s, I'll be bound. VJ Day is important to me because both my parents were in that theatre of war. My father was an RAF pilot, and my mother was a Dutch internee who had also done a bit of spying and a lot of translating. My father was the son of a carpenter, and he was born in Deal on the 14th of March 1922. My mother, a diplomat's daughter, was born in Austria on the 18th of July 1922. As I've already said, she was not Austrian, she was Dutch. My grandfather had been posted to a position as language secretary to the Dutch ambassador in Tokyo, and he was on his way there by land and sea with my very pregnant grandmother when my mother was born. The chances of my parents, these two very different people from very different backgrounds, ever meeting was quite remote, and yet they did. Not in England, nor in Japan. But I'll come to that. My parents were just ordinary young people when war broke out. My mother had one much younger sister, and my father was the youngest of six. His eldest brother was 28 years older than him. My grandmother was an astonishing 52 years old when he was born. He never knew his father, who died when he was 2. My grandmother remarried, and the family was a strong and well-loved unit. My father joined the RAF on leaving school in July 1940. He was 18 years old. After flight training, he was posted to 82 Squadron at RAF Bodney in Norfolk, flying Blenheims. He was 19 when he crashed his first Blenheim. Unlike some of today's 19-year-olds who have to find a safe place to go and cry when someone says something that disagrees with their delicate opinions, he was airborne again 4 days later. Meanwhile, my mother was in Java. I should explain at this point that my grandfather was sadly killed in a road accident in 1936, so my mother and family moved first to the Netherlands and then to Java to live with my great-uncle, who ran a sugar plantation there. Both my grandparents were originally from Java. My grandmother thought that they would be safer there than in Europe, where war was brewing. Little did they know. As well as her native Dutch, my mother spoke Japanese, having lived in Japan for the first 14 years of her life, American English because she attended an American school in Tokyo until she was 10, and German because she attended a German school thereafter until her father was killed, and French, of course, because she learnt it at school. The point is that she spoke Japanese, and this was how she became a sort of a spy. Not the James Bond type of spy, but in Java there were very many Japanese stores where you could take a cup of coffee whilst doing your shopping, a bit like the old American Cracker Barrel shops. She would cycle around her area, dropping into these stores together with my 9-year-old aunt, and sit and listen to what the Japanese were saying. No one suspected that this European girl could understand what they were saying, and she would then report back to the KNIL, the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. Following the Empire of Japan's entry into the war, just note that Japan had an empire too. On the 7th of December 1941, 82 Squadron was posted to India in May 1942, where they took delivery of their new aircraft, the Vultee Vengeance dive bomber. According to my father, its best use was ferrying crates of beer. It was a badly designed aeroplane. To begin with, the centre of gravity was too far back, but redesigning it would be too expensive, so the wings were built pointing forwards, giving the aircraft the look of the letter W when viewed from above. The angle of incidence on the wing was so low that it had to fly nose up, which didn't do much for pilots' visibility. It's interesting that the RAF, the Australian Air Force, and the Indians flew these American machines, but the Americans didn't. Still, in the hands of our Commonwealth, they did their job well, once they had figured out how to stop flying them into the ground after a dive bomb attack. So thanks to the war, my parents were getting closer, although still a few thousand miles apart. As to my Dutch family, the men were rounded up and shipped off to the Burma Railway. Not one of them came back. The only one we have news of is my great-uncle, who was beaten to death by the Japanese guards because he stepped in to stop a fellow prisoner from being beaten to death. The women and children, including my mother, then 21 years old, my grandmother, and my then 10-year-old aunt, were interned in a concentration camp. If you ever watched the television series of Tenko, you'll have some idea of the conditions that they lived in. Because my mother spoke Japanese, she was co-opted as a translator when the Japanese were interrogating any Dutch POWs. She would not always translate what the prisoners had said, but would modify their replies where they had fallen into a verbal trap. This was quite risky because, whilst it was unlikely, there was always the possibility that one day one of the Japanese officers might have taken the trouble to learn a bit of Dutch and would find out what she was doing. Luckily, that didn't happen. My father was piling on the flying hours, and he eventually clocked up 104 missions. Many of those ops took place after VE Day. Whilst the people of Europe celebrated the peace and started rebuilding Europe, there were many still fighting a vicious enemy in the East. There were no VE celebrations for them. People were dying. Civilians were living and dying in the most appalling conditions in the concentration camps, and the enemy wouldn't give in. And my father hated Vera Lynn's White Cliffs of Dover. He came from Deal and went to Dover Grammar School, and he didn't want to be reminded of those cliffs after nearly 3 years away. So, whilst my father was dive-bombing Japanese positions in Burma, my mother was imprisoned as a guest of the Japanese emperor. Neither of them would discuss what happened during that time unless it was to relate something light-hearted. My father, for example, related the tale of a small bear that had adopted them in India when they were stationed at Feni, just on the borders with Burma. And Feni, incidentally, is in what is now called Bangladesh. They christened the bear Jubbly. The air crew were living in field tents, a bit like MASH, if ever you watched that series. Jubbly had a habit of wandering into a tent, tipping the occupant out of his hammock and getting in himself. On one occasion, a newcomer came screaming out of the latrines with his trousers round his ankles because as he sat on the long communal latrine bench practicing his bomb aiming, Jubbly's head appeared from the hole next to him. Hard as they tried, no one could coax Jubbly out of the latrine. The medical officer had brought a couple of shotguns with him from Blighty, so he took one and my father took the other, loaded with blank cartridges, and they marched into the latrine. One stood at one end and one at the other, and they fired all 4 cartridges into the latrine. The result was that they were both covered in that stuff that usually travels when it hits the fan, whilst Jubbly lay on his back at the bottom of the trench enjoying his mud bath. Eventually, the Japanese surrendered. My father was, I believe, the only survivor of the original batch of pilots who came out in 1942. So at the age of 23, he was dropped into Java as part of the RAPWI team. RAPWI stands for Repatriation of Allied Prisoners of War and Internees, sometimes known as Recovery of Allied Prisoners of War and Internees, and often wryly referred to as Retain All Prisoners of War Indefinitely. It was there that he met my mother. She had been liberated from the concentration camp and was working as a translator for RAPWI as they interrogated the Japanese POWs. So even after VJ Day, the work was still being done to sort out the mess made by the Axis powers. And I just hope, and I know it's a forlorn hope, but I just hope that this little tale will remind people that the war was not just in Europe. And I hope it reminds the snowflakes out there that ordinary men and women fought against real Nazis and against real fascists. They were shot at and bombed and put into concentration camps where in Europe they were killed wholesale, and in the East they were starved and beaten and kept without the medicines sent by the Red Cross. When my father first met my mother, she had a 14-inch waist and she had lost 3 teeth. She was 23. So when you throw paint over Bomber Command Memorial or burn the Union Jack on the cenotaph, feeling all brave and virtuous, just spare a thought for all those ordinary people on all sides who did what they did because of the power-seeking politicians, the actual Nazis, whom you know nothing about, the cruelest of medieval societies in the East that you have no conception of because you never pick up a book that might offend you. Think about those who suffered, who lost life, limb, sons and daughters, fathers and mothers, but who carried on the fight against the real tyrants, actual genocidal racists, so that you can have the freedom to live in a world of peace, a world that you are tearing apart with your stupidity and your own brand of fascism, where you refuse to discuss anything you find remotely offensive, where you use feelings instead of facts and political correctness instead of truth. Think about people like my mother, who was put into an actual concentration camp by actual Japanese, but who never held it against the entire race afterwards when peace came. The way that you point at white people and say we are all guilty of something that we didn't do just because we are white. Try reading a history book. Stop hiding from things that offend you, or you will bring the whole house tumbling down about your ears, because you are feeding the beast. You are stirring the poison pot of racism and intolerance, all in the name of racial harmony and tolerance. Only you are too stupid and too blind to see it, because you refuse to look, you refuse to listen, you refuse to learn, and I despair. See you.